Hello, everyone, and welcome. So today, I'm going to be talking about hacktivists. And I appreciate that when we talk about threat actors at cybersecurity conferences, almost inevitably, we talk about ransomware. We talk about ransomware groups. We talk about all of the things that they do and the way they operate and the organized crime set of things. The concern I have, and the concern I've been seeing over the last few years, is actually hacktivism has gone up. We've seen a huge increase in hacktivist activity, very capable actors as well. And one of my concerns with all the attention that we're giving ransomware and ransomware groups is that we are actually diverting some fairly important attention, both from ourselves, from government, et cetera, away from what a lot of people wrongly consider a sort of old adversary, someone who would be going after banks, companies within the extractive industry, and by and large, that's about it. And that really isn't the case anymore, and certainly not in the last few years. And one of the first instances, actually, that's of a big organization being hit with what we now call hacktivists was NASA in 1989. And NASA released the documents about how this happened. At the time, NASA were about to launch the Galileo probe. And the concern became that this Galileo probe had a ton of nuclear power attached to it, et cetera. And so environmental activists decided to take action. This particular group were actually in Australia. And they actually infected NASA. And the story goes that the scientists came in to work that day, put their coffee down, went to go and load their screen. What we now know as a splash screen in the industry came up, and it said, your system has been officially wanked. And this was one of the first cases we saw of this against big organizations. The term hacktivism was coined by someone called Omega from the Cult of the Dead Cow way back when, 1996, I think. And some people claim it was a journalist who came up with it. By and large, it doesn't really matter. We then saw those sort of anonymous years, and this was kind of the rise of the online activist. And anonymous was interesting because they were a decentralized collective of people who were politically and ideologically aligned, motivated, et cetera. That's very much shifted now. And I think for me, looking at the sort of data that we have on this, the big shift happened on the 24th of February, 2022. Does anyone know what happened on the 24th of February, 2022? Yeah, Russia invaded Ukraine. And the moment that that happened, we saw a real shift, actually, in the landscape of hacktivism, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So one of the things that when I say hacktivism, people's minds immediately go to DDoS attacks. But actually, hacktivism is a term that describes any cyber attack that's politically, socially, ideologically motivated. So it could really be anything. So it doesn't need to be limited to DDoS attacks. Actually, we've seen quite the opposite. We've seen that it's actually evolved quite significantly over the last few years. One of the key factors in that is political and societal polarization. Across the world, we've seen the polarization of society in terms of both political ideologies and other things. And that has really, really led to an invigoration of this threat group. The other big shift we've seen is how they're organizing. So back in the anonymous days, it was very much kind of covert, dark web type stuff. That's not really the case anymore. By and large, hacktivist groups organize on encrypted chat channels and mainstream social media. And that's not by accident. The reason that they do this is because it creates a really low barrier to entry for people to get involved. So even people who aren't technical, but might think their ideology is admirable, can get involved in fundraising, get involved in sharing the message or proliferating what they're doing. And it's also better to just get promo and get funding. So we've seen that that's been another really, really big change. So we have some DDoS attacks. They do happen. That's still a main thing that happens. But the other thing that we've seen a lot of recently is data exfiltration, so deliberate going in, stealing the data, publishing it online. Hacktivists, by and large, they don't care about getting money from you or holding it to ransom. They honestly just want to make you look stupid. They want to make a big scene out of it, which led to their second sort of style of attack that came in a couple of years ago, which is kind of a poisoning element to the data exfiltration. And what I mean by that is what they'll do, which makes it pretty difficult from a crisis management perspective if you're hit with this, is they'll go in, let's say to a bank, they'll steal a ton of data, they'll post it online, promote it obviously on their social media channels, promote it on their Telegram channels, etc. But inside that data set will be injected fake data that they've created to make it look a certain way. So it may be that they're trying to make it look like you're transacting with a nation state who you should not be transacting with, or that you're buying rubles if that is an embargoed thing in your industry, for example, whatever it is. And that makes your crisis management quite difficult, because now you've got to explain the data exfiltration, you've got to admit you're breached, but you've also got to go through almost data by data and say, that was ours, that's fake, that was ours, that's fake, which makes a big scene out of the whole thing. And that's the MO. That's all they want. They want a big scene. So some of the hacktivist activity we're seeing, the main sort of 3 areas really that we're seeing is sort of hacktivism around Russia, Ukraine, hacktivism around Israel and the Middle East, and then also environmental concerns as well. And I'm going to go through those in turn. But before I do, I think the other thing that people think is that hacktivists used to be sort of very strong in their political beliefs. Anonymous, for example, were very clear, actually, in what they were trying to achieve. Nowadays, it's changed a little bit, and there are some groups now who say quite bizarre things that I think shows you that sometimes they're involved in it for reasons that you wouldn't necessarily think. So these are just an example of some of the biggest hacktivist groups that we have around at the moment. And this was a quote that one of them put out. And they basically said that, as you might know, we don't like Israel, but we also don't like war. So we've attacked Israel, and now we're going to attack Gaza. So again, you've got a situation where a hacktivist group saying almost that they've got a pacifist stance on war, but they're going to attack both sides for that reason. So it's a very confusing situation. In the way ransomware really isn't, because we understand ransomware. We understand it's a business model. So the other thing that we have that's a sort of spin-off from this, it's another issue with hacktivism, is that hacktivism has been observed, certainly in the last few years, as being a facade for state action. And the reason for this is that it's a great way to launch attacks that are plausibly deniable for states. And it's a really difficult ground from an international law perspective. Because in international law, to claim that a group, for example, Killnet, who are a pro-Russian hacktivist group, to claim that that group are part of or actors of the Russian state would be very, very, very difficult. The barrier, the test, so to speak, of whether or not a group is a nation-state actor is incredibly high. If you look at the international jurisprudence on this, they will say that funding, for example, is not enough. If Russia are funding all of Killnet's activities, that's not enough to say Killnet are working as part of the Russian state. It has to go far, far further than that. So it makes it quite difficult. And nation states have provided safe harbors for groups, they've provided funding, they've provided everything from that sort of safe harbor all the way up to full support. And it makes it very, very difficult to know what is actually behind it and how capable they actually are. So one of the phrases that gets sort of leveraged a lot, because obviously we have environmental activism, but by and large, a lot of the hacktivism is coming from the 2 major conflicts that we're seeing at the moment. And people have coined or thrown the phrase, which I really hate, so I hate that I'm about to say it, the democratization of warfare. But in some respects, it's actually a really accurate way of describing the situation. So suddenly, we find ourselves in a situation where anyone can get stuck in to a conflict, which typically wasn't really the case before. You know, getting involved in sort of kinetic warfare was actually not something that we could all do from our sofas, right? And one thing that we saw that was really interesting, probably more so actually than with Russia-Ukraine, was on October 7th, 2023, the Hamas-led attack on Israel happened. Within a couple hours, a group called Anonymous Ghost, they are a Palestinian hacktivist group, they took down a ton of Israeli news agencies. We also saw another group called Moroccan Black Cyber Army, who again attacked a load of Israeli organizations within hours of this attack happening. Sarah just talked about how quickly attackers tend to react to news. It's exactly the same in the hacktivist space. The second day, something really interesting happened that I think shows the problem that we're seeing here. So on day 2, so 2 days after the attack, the Indian Cyber Force, which is another hacktivist group, shocker, based in India, they hit a ton of Palestinian companies. And in response to that, the pro-Palestinian hacktivist groups, which come from Iran, Palestine, Morocco, etc., attacked the Indian government, taking websites offline, and attacked key Indian companies. And the reason this is interesting is, if you think about Hamas attacking Israel, if you're an Indian company, are you thinking that the threat has suddenly skyrocketed for you at that moment in time? Probably not. India's got nothing to do with this conflict, ostensibly. But the actions of a hacktivist group within that nation state attracted attention from hacktivist groups that were opposed to them. So all of a sudden, what you see is companies that wouldn't be that concerned, governments that wouldn't be that concerned, are being pulled into a conflict almost against their will because of the hacktivist threat that comes from it. So they do have a lot of power. But it's not just about the nation-state side of things. So KillNet are interesting for a number of reasons. And I could do a whole day talk just on the shenanigans that they have been up to. But one of the interesting things about KillNet that I think we have to understand is how we've pivoted away from this anonymous brand with hacktivism. And what I mean by that is that the head of KillNet came out and he said, well, we can't survive anymore just on donations alone, because typically it was crowdfunded. So just over a year ago, KillNet launched an online training school, which they call Dark School, which provides cybercrime training for anyone who wants it. I think it's like $250 per course or something. There's a ton of courses on there. Anyway, you can get it in like English, Russian, all different languages. And they've had a lot of success from it, and they've made a lot of money from it. And they've also started selling hacktivism as a service, which sort of seems like a contradiction in terms, really, doesn't it? Because that doesn't sound much like hacktivism anymore, but okay. And so this is why we're seeing this shift. Again, they're shifting as well to a more organized crime model with their attacks. So, and I'm conscious of the time. So one of the other issues that I've seen a lot with my clients, so a lot of what I do when I'm not talking and going and making pottery with Sarah, which does seem like the bulk of my time sometimes. I provide sort of crisis management consultancy into organizations, helping them build incident response things. And we've been looking a lot at hacktivism because a lot of my clients, this is one of their main concerns. And one of the problems that we've had is actually the sort of, unlike ransomware, which is sort of an almost consistent threat that you have, with hacktivism, it's a little bit different. And the best way to illustrate this was about a year ago, President Macron made a statement that no one was expecting. He obviously came up with it, put it out, whatever. And the other side, shall we say, of this political ideology decided to attack a ton of French websites and French government websites and take them offline straight away. And one of my clients said, the problem is, we can't control what prime ministers and presidents say. And if we get this reaction from something that's been, a government decision, how do we plan for this? How do we respond to this? And we've seen people who've had a CEO whose wife has been Iranian, and that's been sufficient. We've seen ridiculously minor things be used as a justification for why this hacktivist group's going to attack this company. And because they're not after money, it really doesn't matter to them. As long as it's big and loud and makes a big scene, then that's all they want. That's brilliant. So it poses a really difficult problem. And like I said, typically they were crowdfunded. They were you pay on the Telegram channels and things like that. That's sort of shifting. And I think sort of the key problem here is when you're thinking about it from a crisis management perspective, when you're thinking about how you would prepare for something like this, the problem is it's very hard to stop. bigger problem is they are going to make damn sure it is the most public thing that could have possibly ever happened, because this is their whole raison d'etre. If it's private, if it's quiet, there's no point in that at all. And it makes it really difficult, because they may be targeting you for reasons that you don't really even understand, some really bizarre fringe reason that they've come up with. And they are really capable. The capability within hacktivist groups is worryingly good. So I think the problem, which I've highlighted without solutions, so you can just sit here and mull over how miserable this talk has been after lunch, is that we have this really difficult situation facing us. And I think if we think about this as a bigger problem, if you've got people who are impressionable online, looking at social media channels of KillNet, for example, thinking actually their ideologies do align with mine, I will help them raise money, I will go and do one of their courses. We're in a situation where actually the more polarized we become as society, the more we sort of feed this. And then we're sort of glamorizing a lot of the things that they're doing online. So it is becoming a really big problem. I'd like to see people talking about it more. But one of the quotes I just want to end on, which was said by a lecturer actually to me the other day, and he said that the problem with hacktivism is when you combine freedom of speech and anonymity. And when you combine them together, this is what you get. So on that happy note, if you have any questions, do come and find me. Otherwise, I'll pass back to Sarah. Thank you very much, everyone.